I am Emily Howard, and this is my personal project report. The first step in anyone's personal project is investigating. For me, investigating was determining if I wanted to potentially go into a baking and cooking route. Those are two things I'm very interested in, I enjoy. Or whether I wanted to go into writing, which is what I chose to do. So like I said, I chose writing. In that, I had to set a goal. So because writing, it's a long process, it's rewarding, but it's difficult. You have to work past struggles, writer's block, even just a decrease in creativity that you're not used to experiencing. So I knew with this project I wouldn't be able to complete an entire book. I knew that wasn't a feasible, not a reasonable goal. So I decided that I would write the first 3 chapters of a book, create a good foundation for that, and the way I knew I would have completed that goal is simply just having 3 chapters. I decided that each of the chapters needed to be over 500 words just so they weren't so short. But the next part was research. So in my research, I found a lot of helpful sites. I found a website called Hemingway App, which is really nice for editing after you've started writing. It points out any adverbs, tells you for the size of your writing how many adverbs are preferable. It also tells you if sentences are difficult or very difficult to read, which is helpful when you're trying to put your thoughts into words and write them down, because sometimes what's in your head doesn't quite translate onto what's on the paper. So I found that website really helpful. And then I also found a website called ilys.com. So essentially with that website, it allows you to write without going back and editing. So I found in my project that I had struggles with just keeping a continuous flow of writing, which is something you are supposed to do so that you don't over-edit yourself. So that website essentially allows you to set a word goal and only allows you to see the last letter that you typed when you're typing. So I found that very helpful just for my personal use, because I do tend to go back and overthink what I'm doing instead of continuing writing. The next step in the personal project is planning. So this wasn't too difficult for me. It wasn't a big undertaking. In my planning, I decided that I was going to write my first chapter in October, my second in November, and my third in December. This left plenty of January and February for editing January, and finally making the report in February. So in the planning, I had to decide what my concept for my book was going to be. So in planning my book, I found a clock diagram to be the most helpful tool in planning out kind of not only my first 3 chapters, but kind of where the book was going to go after. So the diagram starts at 12 o'clock, which is status quo, and in my book, I decided that would be just kind of the first chapter, the exposition, kind of explaining what's gonna start happening in the book. So for me, in my book, that is so 2 girls, Willow and Eliza, are waking up for an adventure. They are going to a remote tropical island to study the plant life and animal life for a school summer trip. And they aren't expecting what comes next in the call to adventure, which is the 1 o'clock position. So in my story, the call to adventure is this storm. So while they're on this boat traveling to the island that they're going to explore, they get caught in a horrible storm on the Atlantic. So this leaves them in kind of a poor position. They don't know what to do because no one was expecting, no one prepared. Sure, they have lifeboats, but with the height of the waves, how are they going to feasibly survive in a little boat compared to the large boat that they're on then? So next is meeting the mentor. My main character, Willow, doesn't really have necessarily a mentor, but during the storm, she meets Nolan, who will be her love interest in the future for the story. The third is departure. So this is really when, honestly, the departure in my book is an actual departure. It's when she sets off from the main boat in a lifeboat because the main boat is gushing water into the hull. Or the hull has been damaged and water is gushing into the boat. So in this, Willow and Nolan, who are in the boat together, they set off from the large boat and they wake up on a beach. So the trials are just started in the third chapter with Eliza being hurt from the storm, and they will continue throughout the rest of the book, but with my goal only being 3 chapters, that was what I left it at. So with this book, the trials will definitely will not be few and far between. They have to survive on this remote island that no one knows where they are because it's not their original destination. At 5 o'clock, there are the helpers. So these will be people that she meets on the island that she might not have known necessarily very well before, but they're classmates, teachers, crew members. And then at 6, you have the crisis. At 7 o'clock, you have treasures. So I'm not sure if I'll make this treasure an actual accomplishment where they've gotten off the island, or if they'll find a sense of peace and happiness living on the island. Because to me, treasure doesn't have to be physical, it doesn't have to be something you can hold. Sometimes it's a feeling of peace and calm and acceptance. The 8 o'clock position is the result, so this will be whether they get off the island or not. 9 is the return, and that doesn't necessarily mean they return to the world in which they originated. I think that this return to normalcy could be a return to feeling normal, to accepting the life on the island. 10 o'clock is the new life, so this is their changed life. While they still have a sense of normalcy, something came from their journey. And the 11th position is the resolution, generally speaking, last chapter. I think overall this diagram really helps me kind of picture what is going to happen in the future of my story. So that kind of concludes the planning. So the third step of this project is taking action. So in my taking action, I wrote my book, or my first 3 chapters. So in this, I actually wrote the first 2 chapters in October, contrary to my plan, but I was very glad I did because November came and I had the worst writer's block. I could not think of where I wanted the story to go, how I wanted to make it go there, how I wanted to guide, how I wanted the ship to wreck, how I wanted the result of the shipwreck to be, or what I wanted it to be. In December, I finally cranked out my last chapter. So with all those 3 chapters said and done, I was able to go back in January and edit, and that was where the Hemingway app came in very handy. It allowed me to, like I explained before, just kind of go back and see what might make sense to me. Doesn't necessarily make sense to everybody else because I know things about the world I've created that the reader isn't going to know because they're not me. So in this, edited. So I found that my story was a lot of dialogue, and I was okay with that because the dialogue kept the story moving, but it also made it hard to get a feel for the characters. So in character development, or when you're characterizing a character, you do look at their actions, but you also need to look at their thoughts and kind of who they are internally, because sometimes what they present to the world isn't necessarily who they actually are. So that was a big process in editing. I had to go through, see kind of what I needed to change. That brought me to the fourth and final step of this project, reflecting. So editing was a lot of reflecting on my work. That's really kind of the physical manifestation of reflecting, was the editing, the red lines and blue lines and whatever paint I had at the time, crossing through what I didn't like, circling what I did. It was a lot of marks, scratches, and it took a lot of time, but in the end it resulted in a much better product than had I put out the first 3 chapters that I wrote originally. So in reflecting, I realized that I needed to allow time for the writer's block that I experienced. I needed to allow time for family issues that came up. I needed to sort of manage the time better when things didn't go the way I expected them to. I realized that, like I said, nothing ever goes exactly how you expect it, so you do have to go back and you have to look over what you've written, what you've done so far. When I wrote the last chapter, I probably read the first 2 3 or 4 times just to make sure that I didn't disrupt the flow of the story, so that I made sure it continued logically, which is something I had to work on, because when I first started writing the 3rd chapter, I had forgotten where I was in the 2nd. So that's a big thing I realized that I needed to do, was periodically just go back, read the first few chapters, figure out where I left off and where I needed to continue, what I needed to make sure I addressed. So I didn't leave a bunch of plot holes and just gaping monstrosities instead of a logical stream of events. So in this project, I found that it kind of helped me communicate with others better, because I had been putting my thoughts into word form in my writing for my book. I was able to better put my thoughts in word form when I was speaking to others, which was good for me. This project also taught me a lot about time management, so allowing time for the failures, for the hiccups. In this project, I would probably change my time frame a little bit. If I went back and did it again, I would suggest to anyone else doing this is that they allowed time for the hiccups. I'd just say to anyone else attempting writing first 3 chapters, a book, anything like that, pace yourself. Allow yourself time. Don't overdo it 1 month and then completely fall behind the next. Were I to do this project again, I would just tell myself, it's okay if something doesn't sound good. If it's just a filler and you want to come back later to fix it, that's okay. Because you will come back later, you'll fix it, and you'll find something so much better to put in its place. In the end, I really enjoyed this project. I enjoyed the opportunity it gave me to write, the opportunity it gave me to share a bit of myself with my community. And I'm thankful for the opportunity it presented me to just write and get better at writing. Without further comment, that was my personal project report.